Well, I'm the director of the Canadian Rivers Institute, and I'm here to introduce the Hynes Lecture series, followed by Donald Baird, who's going to introduce our speaker today. So the Hynes Lecture series, the Canadian Rivers Institute Hynes Lecture series started in 2002 with the award of an honorary doctorate to Noel Hynes. So Noel Hynes is known as the father of the ecology of running water, essentially. So for his seminal work in the area of rivers and running water. So originally from the UK, he did work in agricultural entomology, and he called himself an entomologist gone wrong because he wanted to devote himself to the study of aquatic insects. So and he did so far ahead of his time, and in fact, he wrote the biology of polluted water in 1960. So work which was way ahead of its time. He came to Canada to the University of Waterloo in 1964 to be the founding director of the biology department there. And while there, he wrote his book, The Ecology of Running Waters, which has always been considered the first Bible on running waters, really. And some of the theories and things that he thought about was way ahead of his time. So his interest was actually gammarids, his main interest, and he remained active to the end of his career. So he published his last paper in 2008 before passing in 2009. So so each year the science directors of the CRI meet, and we look at some of the world's leading contributing scientists to freshwater science to choose a recipient that exemplifies the science contributions of Dr. Hynes in his honor. So we've had the privilege of hosting many of the world's top scientists at the Hynes Lecture in freshwater ecology. We're very pleased to have it again this year in 2015. This is the third of a series of lectures, 2 science lectures, one at St. John and one here, and the public lecture last night. So now Donald will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. We got the presentation up, which is good. It's my pleasure, really, to introduce to you Dr. Julian Olden. After growing up in a sailboat on the waters of Lake Ontario, Julian obtained his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Toronto, and then moved on to study at Colorado State University, where he obtained his PhD in 2004, working in the lab of Leroy Poff, who's interestingly a previous Hynes lecturer in our series. This was followed by a postdoctoral stint at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he was supported by David H. Smith postdoctoral fellowship. And he finally settled at the University of Washington in Seattle, which interestingly was also the host university of our last year's Hynes lecture speaker, so obviously a hotspot for freshwater ecology there. But he's an associate professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Science. He's a burgeoning complement of graduate students and postdocs with an international research focus. His career publications so far number over 220, with over 100 published in the last 5 years, all in top-flight journals. A prodigious output for such a young researcher. He's an in-demand speaker at international conferences with a passion equally divided between communication of his cutting-edge research and together with his students saving the world one fish at a time. Julian's research spans continents, and current work in his lab involves collaborative research with scientists in Australia, Amazonia, and North America. His list of awards is equally impressive and includes an Early Career Conservationist Award from the Society of Conservation Biology, Outstanding Researcher Award from the University of Washington College of the Environment, Stevenson Award from the Canadian Conference for Fisheries Research, the Mason Keeler Endowed Professorship, which he currently holds at University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. He's an Early Career Fellow with the Ecological Society of America, and he's the Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellow at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Key recurrent themes in his work include fisheries conservation and the role played by invasive species in aquatic ecosystems. Today he's going to present the Hynes Science Lecture for 2015, dealing with the contentious issue of climate change. The title is Racing Against Extinction, Will Freshwater Fishes Keep Pace with Climate Change? Julian.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. A short 12 hours ago, I think, I was in this exact same spot, so take two. It's been great. I've kind of met and made very new friends, met old colleagues here. It's my pleasure to be here to give the Hynes Lecture. There's a kind of a deep history of fantastic people showing up here and giving great lectures, and I hope that I can continue this trend as we look forward to this lecture. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about images like this. Images that actually just drive when I got into freshwater to college. Catch fish on a hook and line from my parents' sailboat on Lake Ontario, so I decided to put a snorkel and mask on and dive under the water, which was a heck of a lot easier. So my question back then was probably the same question that drives my interest now is, what factors drive this phenomenal diversity of fish that we see in our waterways? And will my children and their children similarly see these fish species when they go to the same places on the landscape? The real big fundamental challenge is that of climate change, right? There's kind of a lot in a deep history known that climate has been rapidly changing over the course of kind of human history. And that when we look to the future, organisms are going to be able to cope or potentially not cope to this climate change through a variety of mechanisms. One, we're keenly aware that species must be able to move to and disperse to new areas which have similar climates. Potentially, they might shift their life history attributes or phenology in response to changing climates because of changing climate change. And then obviously, they might change their physiology. So these are all kind of different ways in which species might potentially cope. And one thing that's abundantly clear is that unlike past changes in climate over geologic history, what we're seeing over recent decades in this last century is much more faster velocity, a much more faster change. The rate of that change is great. So for example, when we look at studies like this is Chris Laurie and others looking at climate warming over the past. We're looking at about a change of 0.5 to 1 kilometer per decade in the velocity of climate change. That is how climate changes through space and time. But projections say that on average, we're most likely to look at a change of about 4 kilometers per decade. So this is a moving target, a moving line, if you will, in terms of how species might basically keep pace. There's examples of this from the terrestrial landscape. We can overlay that. It interacts with topology and how organisms are going to basically move through those landscapes. There's evidence from marine systems that this is a great paper by Pinsky and others that show that climate velocity change is occurring very fast along our coastal ecosystems, and that many organisms are already responding to that change with respect to dispersing or changing their distributions. So to persist in this rapidly changing climate, much of today's biota is going to have to basically traverse landscapes, and many of these landscapes are human dominated. This is some work that I did with Charles Waller and others to show where basically major groups of amphibians, birds, and mammals in the Western Hemisphere are likely going to have to traverse to stay within their current climate envelope. And that's what these kind of arrows are. So the greater the arrow means there's more species, and it shows that we're essentially going to see highways of biota, mass moving potentially, if they can't actually evolve to these new conditions. And what's really interesting is that many of these areas that they traverse are heavily human dominated. For example, most organisms might have difficulty moving through Atlanta, right? I have difficulty moving through Atlanta in my car. So it's this interaction between the ability to respond and providing the opportunity for these species to naturally respond versus this kind of nexus with human landscapes. So this is the challenge that I'd like to talk to you about today. This idea that although we have an understanding a little bit of how climate might change in the future for terrestrial and marine systems and freshwaters, we've kind of lagged a little bit behind, I'd argue. And that these systems are particularly vulnerable, mainly because most aquatic organisms are ectothermic, and that they live in these highly dendritic river systems, many of which are easily fragmented because of human activities. So I would argue that the survival of fish species will largely depend on their ability to basically respond or disperse in response to these local changes, as well as in terms of more regional challenges they might have with respect to fragmentation. There's some interesting studies that show for vertebrates current rates of evolution to respond to future climates have to be on the order of 10,000 times greater than they are in the past. So given those challenges of evolving in situ, again, I think the ability to organisms to move and stay within the thermal requirements is really important, particularly when we think about just these climate and light management, how we try to open up landscapes to allow aquatic organisms to respond on their own accord. So there is some evidence that fish are on the move in terms of freshwater fish. We know that there's evidence of shifts in timings of migration, mainly from salmonids, as well as poleward movement. This evidence mainly comes from places in the UK, and particularly France, where they've shown there's been basically a half kilometer per decade upstream shift in the distribution of many freshwater fish species. And that patterns of range shift are broadly consistent with expectations based on past climate velocity. But given that velocity is a lot lower than what we're likely to see in the future, I think it's important to ask on whether or not fish will be able to cope with that change. So when I look at an image such as this, these are basically whitefish and brown trout, basically just in a cold water refugia. The fundamental question might be is that when faced with these changing climates, freshwater fish may encounter barriers to movement. Streams might completely dry. They might also run out of river in terms of just there's not enough river, not enough headwaters to actually reach. Or they might be overtaken by that velocity of climate change and simply perish. A gloom and doom perspective, but an important one to look at with respect to just the natural resiliency of freshwater fish to respond to change. So if you will, I'd like to take a look at these two questions. And I hope you agree I did not prepare any other slides. But let's talk a little bit about drying streams. I'm going to bring you down to the desert Southwest, where I happen to do a fair amount of work in the lower Colorado River, give you maybe just some insight into some systems that are maybe not so typical of around here. And then I'm going to just jump out at a large spatial scale and ask the question across the entire continental USA, whether and how fish are going to respond to future climate. So many dryland rivers are basically increasingly cease to flow with respect to changes in climate. In fact, many of these systems are intermittent naturally. That is, they stop flowing for particular times of year. And intermittent rivers are actually the rule, not the exception when we talk about water bodies across the United States. So this is a map of percent intermittent streams from major watersheds, and you can see they far outnumber perennial systems, right? And this is a challenge, particularly the degree in which these systems receive attention, and that some systems, like ephemeral systems, are actually not even addressing complete water. So stream drying can cause longitudinal fragmentation of these systems, patches of wet habitat, and that native species might not be able to persist in these increased drying streams, particularly if they don't have the ability to recolonize habitat when it gets re-wetted. So myself and a postdoc in my lab are interested in addressing this question for one particular river system. And this is located it has tributaries such as this. I just want to highlight the highly dynamic nature that over a 3-day course, you can go from a dry stream bed to wet, and then if I showed you this 2 days later, it'd be back to dry again. So highly dynamic systems. So I want to bring you to the Verde River in Arizona. This is in the central part of Arizona real quick. It's kind of located between Phoenix to the south, Flagstaff to the north. So in addition to climate change, obviously these systems are kind of under increased stress from water appropriation. You know, Phoenix is the second largest, fastest growing city in the United States. I see no evidence of Las Vegas stop using golf courses, and no evidence of LA or San Francisco not asking for water. The Colorado River is highly overappropriated in terms of water, particularly under scenarios of climate change. And I just want to illustrate these two questions. What are the implications of this climate with respect to the drying and patterns of connectivity in this system? And then will native species be able to respond to this increased fragmentation? So what's interesting is that this main stem of this river is actually perennial. It's a perennial desert system. So right now, most of this main stem is free flowing, but that might not occur into the future. So just to show you some images of this system, this is the Verde main stem. It's quite a beautiful river. It's a really nice place to work before May, and then it gets a little too hot, and I go back up to Seattle typically. Beautiful endemic fishes. So we have native sucker, such as the Sonoran sucker and the desert sucker. This is round-tailed chub, so it's like printed. As well as small-bodied dace, and this is moonfin and spike dace, which are kind of ESA listed species. In fact, in the lower Colorado River, over 3/4 of the native fish are listed as endangered under ESA. And another 5 or 10% of those are currently pending. So this is a really at-risk fauna. So we did a bunch of modeling just to look at scenarios, hydrologic change through time. I won't bore you with the details, but essentially these are run runoff models. They basically take excess precipitation and they route that through the channel, taking into account issues of soil, land use, and groundwater contributions. And we're interested in basically looking at the changes in surface water between two time periods, present day and future scenarios, and a whole variety of different GCM models and RCPs. And we are interested in two different components of how this might translate into kind of effects on freshwater ecosystems. We're looking at changes in what we call flow connectivity through time, so the number of zero flow days and the duration of those zero flow days, so when does it go dry, as well as how connected the landscape is with respect to the length of flowing water, and a connectivity index, which talks about the ability, basically, of fish to move through the landscape. So I just want to kind of show this slide to illustrate that there's going to be a greater transition to kind of arid climates in this region. So essentially, this is the what we see in terms of precipitation in the region. Blue is current, red is in the future. And I just kind of want to highlight the fact that we see many decreases in flow during the spring and early summer. This is when all the native fish spawn. These systems are highly dominated by monsoon rain events, particularly, again, in the late summer, early fall, as well as winter frontal storms, both of which are going to be shorter or more decreased. So there's really definitely a strong indication of drying across the Southwest. And this year, in terms of drought, if you guys have been following any of the news, particularly throughout the West and California, this is a great window into what we expect to see in terms of what the models predict for future climate. So they always talk about climate change and what's expected in the future, but this is the climate present. So this is just a quick figure to show the take-home message. I like this heat map. Pretty simple, from downstream to upstream along the main stem. Each one of these little cubes is a day through time on average. So for any one river segment, you can look through time vertically, or for any day, you can basically look across the entire river course this way. And the red just indicates those segments or days in which go dry. Right? So in general, there's kind of drying that occurs within certain segments, but that pales into comparison to what we expect to see in the future. We get to see a lot more extended periods of stream drying. And at any one time, you can basically cut through this, and you can see that it's highly fragmented, going from wet to dry, highly fragmented environments. So obviously, this is a challenge, particularly for how native fish are likely to persist in these systems. So what we see is both chronic and prolonged stream drying. Just want to illustrate a couple of things here. This is present day versus future. And what we see is there's a projection of longer dry fragments. We're going to see more dry fragments across the landscape and less proportion of the network that has water. So this is less available habitat. That's the take-home message, and that's the challenge. So what we wanted to do is go beyond that and ask just a simple question of how native fish, are likely to respond. So stream drying segments is a challenge. Imagine stream drying, fish contract their ranges into wet habitats, and then when that re-wets, they need to basically colonize across that dry fragment. So essentially, this is a barrier that needs to be overcome to recolonize habitats. And the permeability of that barrier is a function of the size of the fragment and the dispersal ability of that fish. And we know that dispersal ability varies across different species. So we basically put those two together into this index of conductivity, DCI, which basically just ranges from 0 to 100, talking about how connected the landscape is versus fragmented. And this is the plot that I'm showing here. So on the top is the conductivity on the y-axis. Quite interestingly, so this is completely fragmented or completely connected. And this is basically on average in a year. The present day is in the blue, and the future is in the red, and this is just the delta between the two. So you can see in almost all instances, in the future, we're likely to see a much, much lower conductivity in the landscape, so much more fragmentation. And the delta, the difference, is the greatest during the spring, early summer. That's the spawning time for all of these fish species, as well as during the monsoon season when fish typically recolonize and distribute themselves throughout the network. So this is a real challenge, again, for fish. So what exactly does it mean for individual fish? These are the native fish that occur in the system. So range from very small body top minnow, shown here, all the way to very large body, such as a round-tailed chub. So these are this body size right here, and this is their maximal dispersal rate based on evidence from the literature. So we can input that into the model, and then basically this is what climate change means for conductivity for those particular species. So as expected, it's a big challenge for small-bodied fish, about a 40% decrease, now connected the landscape is, compared to about a 25% decrease for larger-bodied fish. So the take-home message from this part is that climate-induced stream warming is going to lead to kind of greater loss of habitat and shifts in habitat availability across the landscape. This reduced connectivity is potentially going to threaten the persistence of native fish, and that we need to think about protecting this connectivity if we want fish to be able to respond to these climate changes. So I just want to revisit this question that we talked about earlier. I've just kind of given you one example of kind of the way in which climate might affect hydrology and what effects that might have in terms of native species persistence. I want to kind of focus in on this next question on whether or not how fish are going to respond to that velocity of climate change and whether or not they might simply run out of river or be outpaced by it. So I'm going to ask this question, if you will: can fish escape the heat? Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Across the United States. So I'm going to present some data today. This is completely unpublished work. I thought, what the hell, you guys look like a friendly crowd. And the great thing about that is that, you know, we'll just have some fun together. How's that sound? All right, cool. So these are some questions I'm going to ask. One, I'm going to say, what is the velocity of climate change in fresh waters? That actually hasn't been asked before, so I'm going to quantify that across a very small region, the continental United States. What species are most vulnerable? I'm going to do that just for a couple species, about 800. And then I'm going to ask the potential time lag. This is kind of the important part. What is the velocity of climate change? And what is the speed at which fish can actually keep up with that edge? And is there a lag? Is velocity, you just can't catch up. You can't keep up with your thermal requirements. Are you getting outpaced? Or are you fast enough? Can you stay ahead of that rate? Okay? So when we think about vulnerability to climate change, there's a whole variety of factors that go into it, a huge body of literature. Typically, it's some function of sensitivity of the species. Typically, this is done to kind of life history traits. There's their resilience, their adaptive capacity, right? And then their exposure to a whole bunch of climate-related factors. So a whole bunch of this goes into it, right? I just illustrated a little bit about hydrology being the exposure. So this study, I'm going to be focusing on 3 different measures at each one of those dimensions. I'm going to be focusing in on physiological tolerances to temperature. Be talking about temperature, velocity, and then dispersal ability. So again, I'm going to be trying to address this for the continental United States as well. This is basically a map showing native species richness and non-native species richness for major watersheds that are projected up there. So here's the challenge, is that there's about 3 million stream segments in the United States, about 6 million kilometers of river. We're looking at about 800 or so fish species. So the challenge is how can we start to understand and answer this question for every stream segment of the United States, right? One, we haven't sampled every river stream segment. We don't have thermal data for every river segment. And I'll show you for a second, we don't have the dispersal ability for every fish, right? Well, that's just pretending. Forget all about all those assumptions, and let's just go ahead and see if we can go through this step. So the first thing I did is basically took species occurrence records for all major watersheds, and then assigned species to all the segments within those watersheds. A first cut estimate of what fish occur in what river segments. And then I validated that with a data set of 10,000 fish community surveys that I put together from a variety of sources, just to make sure that that stream segment assignment worked out pretty well. So if you trust me, I'm Canadian, you can trust me. All right, it's all okay. I've been in the US enough and not to trust me. Okay. So now we know kind of what fish are in each segment. Okay. So let's go through this. Right. three different parts here, right? First, let's talk about exposure. We need to quantify the velocity of climate change with fresh waters. Promise you this is the only equation. I know I lied, there's one more after this. The big challenge is that we don't have good water temperature for all streams of the US, right? We're only kind of monitoring particular systems. So we do have to do the situation in which we have to convert air temperature to water temperature, right? It's not the most comfortable thing we want to do, but we know that there's good regional relationships between the two. We know that it's not a linear association, it's a sigmoidal association, right? Water can only get so warm. That's actually a great thing about water. Well, then it eventually evaporates. And we can model this. So what we did for the entire United States is that at 30-meter grid cells, we assigned water temperature, importantly, maximum air temperature, the very maximum air temperature, for every one of the segments based on regional relationships between air and water. We did that for present day, and then we did that for the future as well. Okay, end of century. So now we basically have maximum air water temperature for every segment in those two time periods. And then we basically calculated climate change velocity. So this is this kind of what we call isotherm shift rates for every river segment. So if now 24 degrees maximum right now, and in the future 24 degrees maximum is going to be 8 kilometers upstream, right? I want to know what's the rate per year of that advancing front. Okay, and basically these are just two calculations in which you look at a vertical displacement of temperature. So this is based on lapse rates, really important in terms of how the landscape or topology influences that relationship. And then you calculate that in terms of kilometers per decade. That's the velocity of climate change. Okay, so that's the first part. So let's take a look at what the data says. This is for every stream segment across the United States. We compared future to current and calculated that rate of velocity change. And this is what we see. On average, climate change velocity is around 7 kilometers per decade. And there's a huge range all the way up to over 100 kilometers per decade. So it's very fast in some areas, right? Those are typically, all right, and very slow in other areas. And in some cases, it's negative. Coastal systems which have an influence of ocean processes in which they're not warming as fast. Okay? But in general, we see a large majority of these are on kind of the right side of zero. So velocity of climate change is quite fast. And this is it mapped across the United States. So what's interesting is that basically where there's really fast velocity is kind of what we expect in some regions. So we know here, if you look at the Mississippi River drainage, or you hit the Rocky Mountains and the Divide, right, very flat areas, in which you have to go very far to kind of keep up with velocity, with the climate change, and that kind of highlights in red. But it's also, there's some other areas which kind of light up. So it's quite interesting. It's a spatial mosaic, if you will. So the next question we have to ask is, do fish even need to move? Okay, so we just modeled maximum temperature, and we basically know from previous literature is that species show, freshwater fish show very tight associations with their thermal tolerances. So we can use thermal tolerance as an idea of whether or not a fish needs to move or not. And one way to do that is looking at critical thermal maxima. This is the temperature in which a fish loses equilibrium. There's actually a wealth of very good experimental work out there, kind of looking at that for different fish species. In fact, kind of looking across the data, across studies is we collect about data for about 133 fish species in which we know critical thermal maximum. So this is one measure of performance, and I'd say it's kind of the ultimate endpoint that a fish does not want to cross. It doesn't want to be in habitat which exceeds its critical thermal maximum. Now the issue is that we don't have this information for all fish species across the United States. We only have it for about 133. So what we did is a traits-based approach to try to predict critical thermal maxima for all 800 species. And we can do that using some critical traits like phylogeny, adult thermal gild, cool, cold, warm, reproductive gild, and time of spawning. There's some recent evidence suggests that these traits are linked to critical thermal maxima. And in fact, if we plot up critical thermal maxima, shown on the y-axis, as a function of these three different traits, we can see there's actually some nice strong correlations. For example, adult thermal preference, as you go from cold, cool to warm, you basically have increasing critical thermal maxima, right? Warm water fish typically can cope in higher temperatures rather than cold. Sculpins, salmonids, centrarchids, in terms of the range. We also know that fall spawners typically have a lot lower thermal tolerances compared to spring. So what we can do is we can take those traits, we can shove them into a model based on the 133 species. We use a classification tree or a boosted classification tree to then predict critical thermal maxima for all fish species. Model did pretty good, so we predicted out. And these are the predicted critical thermal maxima for all 800 fish species, shown as percent of species. So we have a range from about 25 close to 45 critical thermal maxima. Right? So there's huge scope, huge variability across fish in terms of potentially what they can cope with in the future. Okay, so bear with me, those are the two different components, right? Now let's get to resilience. This is the ability to fish to disperse. And you're going to see a reoccurring theme here is that we know a little bit about dispersal, about a small number of fish species. So we need to try to project this out across the landscape. What we do know about dispersal is that fish exhibit highly heterogeneous movement. It's really interesting work done by Marco Rodriguez and others, Kurt Fausch, which kind of suggests that we see a strong leptokurtic distribution, so fat tails, in terms of the distance moved by fish. And the fact that we typically have two different types of fish. Those that are stationary, those don't move that much. That usually defines the home range. Versus highly mobile species that move really far. And it's those mobile species that colonize new habitats are really important for rebounding from recovery that we're interested in looking at. So there's been some interesting work by Reidinger and others in Germany that basically attempted to try to look at and do a meta-analysis of maximum dispersal rates for fish across the world. And basically, it adds into that model, and it basically predicts the distance that a fish can move over a certain time period as a function of body length, aspect ratio, which I'll tell you about in a second, and stream order. And the models are actually pretty predictive. So what I did is I took basically a trait database that we assembled for North American fish species. We plugged that into this model to then predict what the maximum distance dispersed per year for each fish. And the first important trait was maximum body size. The bigger the fish are, the farther you can move. And what you'll notice is that I have absolutely no idea the size of every fish for each species that occur in a river segment. So I made the great assumption that all fish were at their maximum ever observed. So super conservative. Every sturgeon is 1.5 meters. All right? Every sculpin, all right, it's the monster now. Okay? So really, the biggest possible. Aspect ratio talks about thrusting ability. Okay, so this is basically the height squared divided by surface area of the caudal fin. Okay, this basically, you separate a tuna, which has a really high aspect ratio and high thrusting ability. I didn't study tuna, obviously, right? Versus a sculpin again, which has a very low thrusting ability. Okay? And then we have stream order for every river segment of the entire United States, so we can make it specific to that area. So this is fish dispersal rates. Each dot is a species. And this is an idea of dispersal rate in kilometers per year. The bubble size is a proportion of body size. So as expected, large fish move very large distances. So we're using sturgeon as an example. And then as fish get smaller and smaller, their dispersal rate gets smaller and smaller. So they go from suckers to the lonely darters of the southeast. Okay. So we now have an idea of dispersal ability and how it varies across the landscape. And this is just to show again there's a strong correlation between maximum body size and dispersal rate. And here's that relationship for aspect ratio. Again, explains less of the variability, a lot of it's in the body size. Okay, so the big question is, should I stay or should I go, right? If I'm a fish, I need to decide whether or not I should move or not. So here are, let's just play this game, so choose your own adventure in some ways, right? So one, is the maximum stream temperature in the future in a segment, does it exceed a species' critical thermal maximum? And if the answer is no, then I'm going to call you resilient. You don't need to move. Right? But if it's a yes, and it exceeds your critical thermal maximum, then I'm going to make you move. you're going to have to move. So again, big assumption here, right? Performance varies greatly as a function of temperature, right? There's going to be great losses in fitness as things get warmer, but again, the conservative look that you only move if your critical thermal maxima is exceeded. If the answer is yes, then there's basically kind of 3 different results. One, is your dispersal ability in kilometers per year greater than the velocity of climate change? If it is, you're staying ahead of the wave. So you're resilient, you're doing just fine. If it's no, you're outpaced, you can't keep up, right? And you see situations in which you run out of river. You have to get up to the headwaters, and there's no more river to go to meet your thermal requirements. This might look all fine and dandy, right over here, but unfortunately, we also live in a damp nation, right? So this is under really unfragmented, assuming completely unfragmented systems, but many of those are going to be blocked by dams. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, right? Topic, of course, that is relevant everywhere, particularly here as well. Okay. So will fish keep pace? So this is based on that dichotomy. I just asked a simple question of is like, what is the percent of every species range that is going to be requiring movement, right? That their critical thermal maxima is exceeded. So this is the percent of species requiring dispersal. Some species rank. Some species, 100% of their range in the future is going to be greater than their critical thermal maxima, and they're going to have to move. And then a whole bunch of species over here, actually none of their range is under risk. So in fact, about 1 in 5 fish species, according to these model results, are going to require upstream dispersal in response to climate change. So the other 80% actually are resilient based on the criteria in which I defined, okay? And about 1 in 10 fish species have about half of their range requiring movement, this 50% mark. So a huge amount of variability and a good proportion of fish that are going to have to move. So is this because it's too hot? So this is the exact same variable on the y-axis, percent of the species range requiring dispersal. Each dot is a species, and this is their critical thermal maxima. And this is kind of what's expected, right? Species that have a really high critical thermal maxima, 0% of their range is likely to have to respond. They're going to do just fine. Species over here, which have low critical thermal maxima, a lot of their range they're going to have to move. But what's really interesting is this huge amount of variability right in the middle. Species with the same critical thermal maxima, some, none of their range has to move, and some 100% of their range has to move. And that's because their distributions vary in the landscape, right? And the distribution of climate change velocity varies in the landscape. They're experiencing different climates. So yeah, it's a little bit too hot, too slow. That's part of the equation as well. Same thing on the y-axis is mean dispersal rate. And again, things that disperse very fast, very little of their range requires movement, so they're going to do just fine. But look at this huge amount of variability, right? Fish that have basically, very similar dispersal rates are experiencing very different challenges when it comes to the future. So that's kind of just a synoptic view of all fish species. I'm actually a fish squeezer at heart, so let's go ahead and get down to a couple of fish species that I like. This is the northern hobsucker. This is an awesome fish. Big catastolid, big concave skull. Doesn't get more attractive in my mind. This. Right? Tuck her up. Check that out, okay? This is this lag response that I've been talking about. So this is the difference between their dispersal ability and the velocity of climate change that they're experiencing. So if dispersal ability in kilometers per decade is greater than the velocity of climate change, that's a positive, so you're going to do just fine. Negative means you're lagging behind. This is the percent of stream reaches in this species distribution. So here's a great example of a fish species potentially is going to do just fine. The large majority of its distribution is in the positive, right? This dispersal is greater than the velocity of climate change. It's going to do just fine. In some cases, it's well ahead. Given its maximal dispersal, I'll be a very large fish. It's going to do just fine, right? And a small amount of its range actually is going to get outstripped and potentially go or get extricated. The contrast is something like the red-line darter. Obviously, the photos are not to scale. This is a much smaller fish species. Has much more limited dispersal. And in fact, you can see the large majority of its species range is actually in the negative. It's lagging behind. It's likely to be outpaced by climate velocity. So this begs the question, those are two native fish that I just showed you. I can't help myself. How does native fish compare to non-natives and exotics? So these are non-natives, so those are species that have been translocated from within the United States. They're native somewhere within the United States. And exotic, it means they come from outside of the United States. So this is a lag response on average across all native species, non-natives, and exotics. And you can see, we see this general increase of more positive. So they have better ability to respond to climate change. So non-native species, unfortunately, in the future are better poised to respond to this climate velocity compared to native fish. What about this situation in which they might actually just be running out of water? So on average, about 30% of fish species ranges that require movement actually will not have the river to move into to obtain their thermal requirements. They are actually in the headwaters and they just run out of river. These are two examples: small, cold water fish, black-nosed dace, Ozark sculpin, very localized distributions, cold water, very poor dispersers. Now, all sculpins are not equal, but evidence suggests from a handful of them that they can move on the order of just meters per year, right? Very restricted species. So this is going to be a challenge, particularly when you don't even have the thermal requirements to move into. Okay, so let's map out all of those fish species, look at the average within each watershed, and then we can really determine maybe what fish faunas are most at risk. So that's what I've shown here for major watersheds. Blue is basically minimal risk. So you're always ahead. That lag is actually always positive. You're ahead of climate change velocity. And then as you go to orange and red, you basically become more and more negative. And this is the average across all fish species within those watersheds. So this is really interesting. Right? There's a series of watersheds which are most at risk to future climate velocity. And real quick, I want to map up climate change velocity shown there. My point here is that there's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not those areas that have the greatest climate change velocity which necessarily show the greatest risk, because it interacts with the resident species that are there and their dispersal ability, right? So it's a function of how far you need to move and your ability to move there. So it's always difficult when you actually highlight watersheds, because sometimes people live in particular areas and they want some examples. So I'm going to go ahead and just like take that bait and go with it. And here are some great examples of watersheds that are at high risk. For example, this is the Uricary watershed. This is in eastern Colorado, a very low gradient species, area with high climate change velocity, very small-bodied fish. And this fauna is highly at risk. Where we have other watersheds, this is the James River that I happen to work on in Virginia, which has basically a very robust potential community with respect to responding to that velocity. Okay, so this is always under the assumption that the landscape is free to move. I'm an optimist. Species can leap over tall buildings, but we know that's not the case, right? In the United States, broadly, we are very proud of our dam building abilities. It's celebrated, such as shown here on the cover of Life magazine, of these engineering marvels. Love the US flag draped over there in Hoover. And the reality is that, again, our watersheds are not unfragmented. This is just an illustration of large dam construction in the United States over the last 150 years. Each red dot is then phased in at the time of construction. Wait for it. That was in the 70s. That was when I was born, right? So 80,000 large dams, 2.5 million small dams and diversions, and I would argue billions of fish passages under culverts that are not accessible, right? So this is obviously a very large issue. So if we go back to those watersheds, each dot here is a watershed, and this is its average lag response. Those are the safe and not safe watersheds that I show. And then I just basically plot a dam density within those watersheds. Again, the naive look at this, as we just talked about earlier, right, is that these are safe watersheds, right? They can respond, they're fast enough. These are the at-risk watersheds that I talked about earlier. But even within these safe watersheds, we see a huge diversity in dams. So there's really going to be many of those watersheds in which maybe the fish should be able to respond naturally and not going to be provided that opportunity. Right, so these are pictures of many of those dams. And if you do the math on this, and again, I was tracking individual fish moving up water courses, but then if you put dams in and say that they no longer can move through that river, about 20% of stream reaches that require upstream movement by fish are actually blocked by about 13,000 dams across the United States. Right, so if they were, that's a fifth, right? So if they were able to move through those dams, then they would be able to basically track their thermal requirements, but they're actually not. Here's, again, just the distribution of the number of species and how many of their stream reaches are blocked by dams. There's some fish species in which 100% of their range that requires movement is blocked by dams. So this is a big challenge. Now wait, you might say there's fish passage, right? Wasn't conservative on this one, right? I assume that all those dams had no fish passages, but we have fish passages, right? This is a great, a great fish passage here. It's quite beautiful. Sorry, I'm going to be cynical here. Here's a couple $100 in Home Depot or Canadian Tire. Here's a great one on the Burnett River in Australia. The Paradise Dam went in, and we thought it was a great idea to put a fish elevator in. This is largely because Australian lungfish live in this river system. They can't get moved through, and they don't use fish ladders, as well as many other fish. And they developed this wonderful multi-million-dollar elevator, I believe, as it opens up. And the Bare Naked Ladies, if some lovely nice music plays, as they enter in. And then they're slightly kicked on the ass on the way out, right? And unfortunately, this was built multi-million dollars just to maintain. And wait for the number of fish that have actually used this fish ladder over the last 5 years. That is not a peace sign. That is the number 2 for all you webinar folks. Okay? So these are challenges. Now again, I'm not saying this is universally true. Fish ladders are used by some fish species, but in general, if you interrogate the literature, it's abundantly clear that they do not promote the passage of fish, particularly the large amount of small-bodied fish in these regions. Okay? So we're taking dams out, though, right? One cannot forget the Elwha River, you know, 1 of 2 dams that came out. And yes, dam removal is occurring. Fish passage is one issue that goes into that equation. And this is the American River Survey that shows the dam removal efforts across the United States. So yeah, it's occurring. They're mainly small dams going in. There's a reason why these bubble sizes are very large. It's to make it seem like there's a lot more that's going on. But it is going on, and I think it's important to highlight. Super important to highlight. But obviously, new challenges lie ahead. This is the distribution of mega dams throughout the world. And if you look at all the white areas that don't have mega dams, they basically get filled in when we think about future dam construction. So whether or not it's the hundreds of new hydroelectric facilities in the Amazon basin, or throughout the Mekong in Southeast Asia, you know, dams are going in and plan to go big dams. And I just want to highlight that the United States, we are not by any means learned our lesson with respect to large dam removal or construction. If you look at President Obama's all of the above energy strategy, it's all about emphasizing renewables right into the future. The biggest source of renewables in terms of environmentally friendly ways of producing energy is hydropower still. This was a report that just came out by the Oak Ridge Laboratory, which looked at untapped potential for hydropower across the United States. That's right, new dam construction. 65 gigawatts of unpotential power is there. It's about equal to what's getting utilized right now. And the stream reaches in color basically are illustrating these different areas. So if you think that we finished dam construction, in places in which we're removing dams, then we're sadly mistaken. A lot of these are going to be large, but also small hydropower facilities that are going in, many of which require not much licensing. So in fact, I just couldn't help myself. If you plot up for each watershed this new hydropower potential and again this lagged response, even those areas in which again fish can respond, there are many watersheds that have very high new hydropower potential, and probably in our lifetime are going to see new facilities go on. Okay, so to facilitate species range shifts and maintain the ability of functioning ecosystems, it's going to be necessary to do a whole variety of things. We're going to need to restore and protect riparian habitat. So one example, obviously, is allowing for active and passive restoration of trees, basically to intercept solar energy, to kind of keep streams cool, providing that ability, longer time for fish to move upstream. So for one example, is I do work in the John Day River in Oregon. This is a major tributary of the Columbia River. It's the last wild run of spring Chinook salmon in the Columbia River Basin, dam-free, but we've had huge droughts, high thermal conditions, which has led to kind of big fish kills. So the question there is, how do we actually identify those areas in which we should restore riparian habitat to cool? One of those questions that we're looking at that is addressing the idea of cold water habitat for basically young native Chinook, and how that relates to this warm water non-native species, smallmouth bass. When this species was first introduced into this basin, only 40 fish were introduced, about 200 kilometers downstream. They thought that they would stay out of salmon rearing habitat and enjoy themselves down there and not move upstream, but in fact they have moved all the way upstream into critical spawning habitat. So what we see right here is, I can't help myself here, this is bass abundance as you move upstream in the river system. And basically we're working at the leading edge of this invasion. So it's positive and then absent, and this is the probability of Chinook being there. Currently, if you actually look into the future, 2080, you can see that bass are going to march upstream, ending around 50 all the way up to 80, and the probability of Chinook basically goes below 0.5. So the projection in the future is that this will become a bass fishery, and the ability to support spring run Chinook will be no longer. But what's really interesting is that, and this is the loss of habitat, what's interesting is that if you restore and you prioritize areas on the landscape, you can result in basically what we call environmental co-benefits. Right? We can talk about areas on the landscape that not only cools the stream for Chinook salmon, but also cools and provides thermal barriers so bass cannot move upstream. And if we actually restore 50%, we can actually discount. Look, Chinook actually comes back. We gain back about 20 kilometers potentially Chinook habitat, and we reduce bass down so that they're not actually present in that upper 20 or 30 kilometers of that river. So again, prioritizing these areas, not only for presently, but for the future. Where should we prioritize riparian restoration so that fish can move in the future, I think is super important. We need to also create policies that promote more permeable landscapes. In the terrestrial systems, they're thinking a lot about that. For example, culverts represent really significant barriers to movement. This is no surprise, we know that, these perched up culverts. This is an estimate of fish on culverts which are not passable by fish in the state of Oregon, about 70,000 of them. So this is a large issue, but obviously there's great restoration that's going in there. These provide opportunities to open up the landscape. I think we need to prioritize where these areas are, not in terms of the percent of kilometers which now provide salmon habitat, for example, but the percent of kilometers which provide the maximum number of all fish species to move upstream in response to climate change. And there's some really interesting work in terms of, I don't know, that looks pretty fish-friendly to me. Okay? But the challenge here is that connectivity is not always good. We know that, again, non-native species are moving upstream. And the fact is, when we make those fish-friendly fish passages, it also opens up the landscape for non-native species to also move into those habitats. So concurrently, there's many places in the world, including here, where we're looking about putting barriers in to stop non-native species from moving upstream, but also that prevents natives as well from moving upstream in response to climate change. So this is a great paper by Frank Rahal about in terms of like, where's an optimal level of connectivity, and how do we address that across the landscape? These are some great examples of purposeful structures gone in. This is a San Juan River to stop non-natives from coming in. Here's a nice fence to stop carp from going in, right? And here's natural restoration where, again, we're promoting disconnected landscapes. And these are tough fundamental challenges for us to think through. And scientists play a really important role to think how we prioritize increasing connectivity versus decreasing. Thermal refugia obviously is going to become really important when we think about providing those opportunities for kind of in situ adaptation, as well as promoting more ability to move upstream. And then there's these kind of gnarly subjects when we think about, how we might think about re-operating dams to provide cold water refugia. So hypomagnetic releases, I would argue, are a really important source of cold water pollution in many areas. But there's evidence, examples in Australia, and then some groups in California, which is talking about how dams can be used to mitigate climate change by releasing cold water. Right, so these are challenges when we think about large dams in the future. And finally, assisted migration or assisted colonization is one option that might enable us to basically move species from their current range into future habitats, which are likely to be suitable, but they can't quite get there. And for example, this might include a lot of small-bodied fish that I told you that are just too slow, they just can't keep pace. So I've actually looked. The big question with that is how far do you have to move fish species? No one's really talked about that. So should we move them or not? So we can look at the results that I showed earlier in terms of that lag, and then ask the question, what is the required translocation distance to keep fish, again, within their thermal requirements? And this provides just a little bit of hard data when we talk about assisted colonization and we get into those debates. What are we really talking about? In some cases, we're talking about just a couple kilometers. And in some other cases, we're talking about 300 kilometers, moving fish far distances. Okay, so my take-home message is about 1 in 5 fish species require upstream dispersal to survive. So the good news is that 4 out of 5 fish species don't, potentially. 1 in 10 have over half of their range, which is going to require this movement. Non-native species, unfortunately, are predicted to be better poised to capitalize or the ability to respond to climate change, and that many of these streams that require movement by native fish can be blocked by dams. So we need, and obviously, to critically think about current and future management and policy options about how we open up connectivity, promote permeable landscapes, and think more to the future rather than just the current when we're thinking about how we reoperate dams, bring dams down, change culverts, and think about how that's going to hopefully promote native species to respond on their own accord in the future. With that, I just want to thank all my funding, and again, thank you for this opportunity to talk to all of you. Thanks.